I always joke with my friends, some people play golf. I've been reading academic books for the last 25 years on religion, philosophy, history, things like that. I find it interesting. So I don't know what that says or how helpful that is, but that's kind of my background as to why I like this sort of stuff. And I don't really know AJ. She was a teacher. She's awesome, and you'll get that from just the short videos that you have. She's a super great scholar, but she's very welcoming. You just like her like the minute you meet her, and she is a great communicator. So that's a nice thing about her. But before we get into all that, I sometimes think like when we do these sort of things, like, oh, we get this book, we're gonna read this book, and we just jump into it, but we don't always think about like what's a New Testament scholar do? Like, what is their job? Or what, they're basically historians, right? But I don't know how often we think about history, or how we think like, how does a New Testament scholar see history? So let's start by just saying like, anybody, if they want, like, what if you say, what is history? What do you think it is? Like, how would you answer that question? What is history?
Events of the past.
Yeah, that's good.
I'd add on events of the past told from the viewpoint of the victors.
Yes.
Yes.
It's told by the winner.
By the winner, that's correct. Yeah. Okay.
Doesn't the loser have an idea of what happened too?
They do, but it's probably been the last 50 years where the loser has maybe gotten to say some things. Yeah. So I actually found it difficult to find a good definition of history, but here's what I found. It's actually from the Encyclopedia Britannica, which I don't know. But history is the discipline that studies the chronological record of events, usually attempting on the basis of critical examination of source materials to explain events. So, the thing there that I think is interesting is we're looking at source materials. So, what's a biblical scholar's primary source? The Bible, right. Okay, so let's take a biblical scholar who wants to who's going to write a book on the historical Jesus. Now let's compare that with someone who's decided they're going to write a book, a biography of Joe Biden. So, what do you think maybe the difficulties or how those two things would be different? What the scholar's doing?
You can still talk to a lot of people who knew Joe Biden when you have fewer other references to sort of cross-reference Jesus long ago.
Yeah.
And he wasn't really a winner, right away either, so.
Right.
And you only go back 100 years for Joe.
Right. Right. So so that's an important thing to think about, I think, is time. So yeah, we're modern people, we're not ancient people, and our access to the ancient world is more limited. I think the other thing that is probably different in these two areas is the Bible is a sacred text. It's a religious text, whereas looking at speeches or writings from Joe Biden have a different, they're just, I don't know, secular, I guess. So dealing with religious texts, I think, probably creates, it makes some difficulties for the historian, because the historian, oftentimes maybe has a particular religious feeling or religious ideas, so they're trying to get to the history, but they also have their own life story in with them. And for example, and this is just an example of some people I've read and sort of, maybe you've heard of them, I don't know. But I think how we see what we're doing with history. So like in historical Jesus studies, Marcus Borg is a guy who's written books. I actually like Borg a lot, but I don't think his history is that good. I like him theologically because I kind of like the figure that he presents. I think it makes sense, and I'm not saying it's bad history. He has a lot of good history, but he makes some moves that I think probably aren't really that great. But I like what he comes up with. Now, his good friend, they wrote a book together, is N.T. Wright. Some of you, I'm sure, have heard of N.T. Wright. He's more conservative than Marcus Borg. I've read a lot of his books too. I think he does good history. He's a great historian. However, I think his views skew some of the decisions he makes. So, I'm less likely to go his way either. Now, the third scholar, his name is E.P. Sanders. Probably never heard of him. I think he does history better, and he has less. I don't know what I'm trying to say. He's focusing more on the history, and the ways what he's trying to get at is more neutral, I guess.
Less bias.
Yeah, I don't know if I want to say bias. I mean, bias is right, but I don't know. But it's more neutral because he's, I think, more interested in getting at the history. And I think the problem with getting at the history sometimes is that there isn't always a lot there. And so how do you reconstruct something when there's not a lot there? For example, he, instead of focusing on particular texts or verses, he says there's like 12 main events, and he wants to go through the events to sort of reconstruct the historical thing. The last anecdote on that, and then I'll get on to something that hopefully you find more interesting, but Albert Schweitzer, I don't know if you've ever heard of Albert Schweitzer, probably. He wrote a book in 1906 called The Quest for Historical Jesus. And it was the first book, so there have been 3 quests, we're kind of in a 4th, I don't know if it's really a 4th or not, scholars argue about that. But the first quest is basically the 18th century, and he goes through all the different people who wrote biographies of Jesus, and he sort of points out like, what most of them came up with was like a 18th or 19th century German philosopher, right? And then he kind of gives his own take. But at the end, and this is interesting, my New Testament professor in undergrad, I liked what Schweitzer did. He didn't because Schweitzer essentially says it's hard to do real history with that. And he says, Jesus comes to us as one unknown is what he ends his book with. But Jesus says, come follow me. And if you think about what Schweitzer did in his life, he went to Equatorial Africa and set up a hospital, and so what was important for him was following Jesus. And though I think he has a probably his history is the launching pad that I sort of follow when I read these books that I agree with, but it creates kind of an interesting Jesus because the Jesus that Schweitzer has is, apocalyptic and not like what we would think of today. But Schweitzer also says that we still experience Jesus today, and it's what we do with that experience, what he teaches us and asks us and calls us to do that's important. So that's sort of some stuff on history. So let's get more towards what we're going to be talking about. What's the main source material for the birth of Jesus? Matthew and Luke, right. Okay. Gospels. What do you think a gospel is? Yeah, proclamation is good because that's partially what gospel means. Good news. Truth, sure. But that's a loaded word. How do you?
I had to think about it.
What do you mean by truth?
Well, we say the gospel truth.
Right.
Maybe these are the four most important books in the Bible, and they try very hard to proclaim the truth.
Yes.
What happened?
Yeah. Okay, so if we talked about like the genre of a gospel, I think it's interesting because I don't know that there's really other literary genres that are like a gospel, because a gospel has what, biography, you know, the hero's tale, miracles, travel narratives. There's the passion narrative, the resurrection. I mean, so it's sort of its own unique book, type of book, and you know, I think you know, gospels. I think they define the content of the Christian message, is sort of what they are. So they're unique. When I was getting ready for this class, I went back to an old textbook, and his name's Joseph Tyson, and he says, a gospel is the formulation of the Christian message in terms of the sayings or actions of Jesus. There's nothing to prevent the gospel, however, there's nothing to prevent the gospel writers from mixing past words of Jesus with later words of the Lord, or with the current theological interpretations of the day. So this sort of mixing has created both a special kind of literature and special difficulties for the historian. So, okay, the last thing I'm going to do, before we get into this, just a basic background of how scholars look at the gospel, the synoptic. I'm going to talk about the synoptic gospels, basically. I think this is sort of interesting because, you know, it puts in context what they're trying to do. So obviously you have Mark, Matthew, Luke, are the synoptic gospels, and the reason they're sort of grouped together is because there are a lot of similarities between the three gospels. Does anyone know which gospel the scholars think is the oldest of those three?
Mark,
Yeah. Do you know why?
I've forgotten why. Well, it didn't have the resurrection as part of it originally, right? That was added later,
Right.
but I don't remember otherwise.
So.
I was gonna say it's also the shortest and carries some of the least amount of detail.
Yeah. So if you.
That. Repeat what he said, please.
Oh, he said it's the shortest gospel and has probably the least amount of detail in it. So those are all right, correct, I think. The main reason scholars think this is if you look at, if you can buy, I don't know if you've ever heard, you can get the gospels in parallel, so you can look at all four of them like next to each other. And if you read Luke and Matthew, what you find is that pretty much everything that's in Mark is in Matthew and Luke. And then between Luke and Matthew, there's also a big chunk of things that are very similar. So not all scholars do this. The general scholarship in this area, and you took most places where you took an undergraduate class in New Testament or a first year, you know, get a student class in New Testament, this is what they're going to tell you. They would say that Matthew and Luke had a copy of Mark to help guide them. And then these other area where there's super similarity, they have, has anyone ever heard of Q, the Q gospel? So Q is the word in German, I don't speak German so I don't know the pronunciation, but Quella means source. And so scholars think that there is some source that we don't actually have of essentially sayings of Jesus that both Matthew and Luke had. And so they drew on those to sort of make their gospels. Now there are some differences between Matthew and Luke, and those are obviously things that the authors of those books did. But that's sort of how we get to where we're at. And of course, one of the things that isn't in Mark, that is in Matthew and Luke, is the is the birth narratives. Well, this is sort of an aside. I don't even have it written down. I mean, there are other infancy narratives of Jesus too in non-canonical gospels. So gospels were written through like the 3rd century. It's just they weren't all selected for our canon. Anyone know when the canon was sort of finalized? I have it written down, but 393. Council of Hippo, and it was reaffirmed at the Council of Carthage in 397. But that list started earlier, but had some other different things. Irenaeus, who was a church father, had a list, but he included a couple other non-canonical writings in his, and it's kind of interesting. I mean, that's a long story of how all that all sort of worked. But anyway, okay. So there's just some basic background on New Testament history. I don't know. Sorry if I bored you with that. So what Levine says she's trying to do as a historian of the New Testament is 1, find the history behind the text. 2, find the literary and aesthetic implications of the text. And 3, see the multiple ways the text can be interpreted to address the needs of the people who hold it sacred. And I think that 3rd thing is important to her because she's a practicing Jew, but she's a New Testament scholar and sees things within the New Testament and within the story of Jesus that relate to her Jewish faith, even though it's different than how Christians would relate the same thing. So, before starting the first video, what she said we should do is sort of make a list, and I'll try to write without being too, hopefully you can read my handwriting. To make a list just off the top of the head of the people in the class, what they think about when they think about the birth story in the Bible. So like, what are just the things that come up here? Like, it can be as simple as like manger, or I don't know, whatever.
Shepherds.
Just shepherds. All right.
I like the shepherds.
All right.
Labor.
Human mother.
Human mother, that's good.
Traveling, the journey.
Yeah.
Government interference.
A sort of cultural practice of marriage and engagement.
Yeah. That's
Poverty.
Too late?
You can see I've never written on a board before. Did someone said poverty, right?
Yes.
Too tall.
Oh, that could be too.
Obedience.
I'm sorry?
Obedience.
Yeah.
Was there occupation then?
Say that again?
Occupation.
Like today?
Denial or unwelcoming.
Angels.
You gotta have wise men, because you gotta have rich and the poor.
Well, they didn't come until later.
I know, but it's still.
Part of the story.
Correct.
I think about the time that all of this is involved,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
about time and like how long this takes.
All right.
The virgin birth is not a unique story. It does exist in history.
For sure.
I was just saying, what about the cross-cultural, like the mythical aspect of it? This is very unusual.
Well, it's not actually unusual in the time period of Jesus. So, for example, like Augustus Caesar was born of a virgin.
Right, that's what I mean, the connection with other cultures.
And so-
Stories.
Yeah. And in some ways, you look at that because if we're going to think of Jesus as a new type of king, you still want to set it in a way that fits the sort of cultural milieu of the time period, so that it's the Hellenistic and Roman time period. I'm sorry, were you gonna? Oh, yeah. So no, that's good.
Hope and joy.
Hope and joy, yeah, absolutely. Sadness.
And like Herod and power struggle.
Herod, yeah. I feel like I wrote that down, but maybe I didn't. I didn't, I guess. Okay, cool. That is a good list. All right, well, keep that stuff in mind, and let's see what AJ has to say in the first video. Oh, you know what? I should probably read the section of the Bible that she's going to talk about more than just this section, but this is sort of the main section of the first video. It is Luke 1:5 through 25 and 57 to 79. So, in the days of King Herod of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly order of Abijah. His wife was a descendant of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. Both of them were righteous before God, living blamelessly according to all the commandments and regulations of the Lord. But they had no children because Elizabeth was barren, and both were getting on in years. Once when he was serving as priest before God, and his section was on duty, he was chosen by lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to enter the sanctuary of the Lord and offer incense. Now at the time of the incense offering, the whole assembly of the people was praying outside. Then there appeared to him an angel of the Lord, standing at the right side of the altar of incense. When Zechariah saw him, he was terrified, and fear overwhelmed him. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you will name him John. You will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth. For he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He must never drink wine or strong drink. Even before his birth, he will be filled with the Holy Spirit. He will turn many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God. With the spirit and power of Elijah, he will go before him to turn the hearts of parents to their children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord." Zechariah said to the angel, "How will I know that this is so? For I am an old man, and my wife is getting on in years." The angel replied, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and to bring you this good news. But now, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their time, you will become mute, unable to speak, until the day these things occur." Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah and wondering at his delay. In the sanctuary, when he did come out, he could not speak to them, and they realized that he had seen a vision in the sanctuary. He kept motioning to them and remained unable to speak. When his time of service was ended, he went to his home. After those days, his wife Elizabeth conceived, and for 5 months she remained in seclusion. She said, "This is what the Lord has done for me when he looked favorably on me and took away the disgrace I have endured among my people." Now the time came for Elizabeth to give birth, and she bore a son. Her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown his great mercy to her, and they rejoiced with her. On the 8th day they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him Zechariah after his father. But his mother said, "No, he is to be called John." They said to her, "None of your relatives has this name." Then they began motioning to his father to find out what name he wanted to give him. He asked for a writing tablet and wrote, "His name is John." And all of them were amazed. Immediately his mouth was opened and his tongue freed, and he began to speak, praising God. Fear came over all their neighbors, and all things were talked about throughout the entire hill country of Judea. All who heard them pondered them and said, "What then will this child become? For indeed, the hand of the Lord was with him." When his father Zechariah was filled with the Holy Spirit and spoke his prophecy, "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, for he has looked favorably on his people and redeemed them. He has raised up a mighty Savior for us in the house of his servant David, as he spoke through the mouth of his holy prophets from of old, that we would be saved from our enemies and from the hand of all those who hate us. Thus he has shown the mercy promised to our ancestors and has remembered his holy covenant, the oath that he swore to our ancestor Abram, to grant us that we, being rescued from the hands of our enemies, might serve him without fear, in holiness and righteousness, who work for him all our days. And you, child, will be called the prophet of the Most High. For you will go before the Lord to prepare his ways, to give knowledge of salvation to his people by the forgiveness of their sins. By the tender mercy of our God, the dawn from on high will break upon us, to give us light to those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the way of peace. Okay.
I love Christmas. I like the candles, I like the trees, I even like the shopping. When I was a child, I used to go to my friend's house to help trim the tree. I had the best of both worlds. I got to trim the tree, I never had to put it away.
Can you hear that? I don't think it's coming through the...
Let's try again.
After the season. But I particularly love Christmas because I love the stories.
I think it's
The
just coming
accounts,
through.
the different accounts we get in the Gospel of Matthew, and we get in the Gospel of Luke, and we get also from post-biblical church legends. I will sometimes come into church and people get very
Testing.
somber and serious because it's Advent. But if we do, we're missing something. Matthew and Luke are stories of joy, and they're also stories of humor about an infertile couple who has a child, and that's the birth of John the Baptist. About the annunciation of the angel Gabriel to Mary, who says, Mary, you're going to have a child, and Mary asks quite logically, how exactly is that going to happen? About Joseph, who discovers that his fiancée is pregnant and has a dream with an angelic prophecy from the prophet Isaiah telling him what to do. And those fabulous magi who aren't kings, and they're not necessarily three of them. They're Persian astrologers. They are figures of fun. They are fools for Christ. We need to see the profundity in the story, but we also need to see the joy, the challenge, the exuberation, to appreciate the story as story, a story that will give rise to multiple interpretations, and a story that continues to inspire. The Christmas story in the Gospel of Luke begins not with Jesus, but with Zechariah and Elizabeth. And we first meet Zechariah, who is a priest in the temple. Actually, there were too many priests at the time to serve on a daily basis in the temple. So this might have been Zechariah's one shot at the big time. He's doing the afternoon incense offering, and suddenly an angel appears to him. He's stunned, but this is the Bible and it can happen. And the angel says to him that, Zechariah, you're a righteous guy, and your wife is righteous, and your wife Elizabeth, she will become pregnant. Zechariah somewhat discreetly says, well, yes, except I'm old and, my wife is getting on in years. And the angel gets a little bit huffy. Look, he says, I'm the angel. I'm reading here from the CEB translation. Zechariah said to the angel, how can I be sure of this? My wife and I are very old. And the angel replied, I'm Gabriel. I stand in the Lord's presence. And I can just picture the angel with this look on his face saying, what, you doubt? Gabriel continues, I was sent to speak to you and to bring this good news, this gospel, this oi angelion, this good news to you. Know this, what I have spoken will come true at the proper time, but because you didn't believe, you will remain silent, unable to speak, until the day when these things happen. Poor Zechariah, he's just received good news, he's just received the gospel, and now he can't talk. But we have to worry about the professional situation as well, because following the offering, he is supposed to go out and bless the crowd. Here's how the CEB describes it. Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah, and they wondered why he was in the sanctuary for such a long time. And when he came out, he was unable to speak to them. Then they realized he had seen a vision in the temple where he gestured to them and couldn't speak. When the Gospels were first produced, they were read out loud, indeed performed to congregations. And the fact is, a lot of people back in the first century were illiterate. They could not read. So I can picture so easily the storyteller explaining not only that Zechariah had been struck mute, and through his gestures, he explained to the crowd what happened. But how do you do that? How do you do in body language the idea that an angel appeared to me? Do you have wings? Do you have a halo? Do you have a look in your face? And the angel said, I'm going to have a baby? What was the crowd thinking when they listened to Zechariah? And more fun, what was the crowd thinking, those first audiences, those first churches, when they watched the Gospel of Luke being performed? How do you proclaim the good news in sign language? The angel Gabriel had told Mary not only that she would conceive a child, but that her elderly cousin Elizabeth, who had been suffering with fertility issues, has conceived herself. So Mary goes to visit Elizabeth. The scene is typically called the visitation, and it's in the Gospel of Luke. Here's how the CEB puts it. Mary got up and hurried to a city in the Judean highlands. She entered Zechariah's home and she greeted Elizabeth. I do wonder if Zechariah is there saying, but she greets Elizabeth. And when Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the child leaped in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. So we have this sense of quickening. Elizabeth feels life in her own body. So Elizabeth then, filled with the Holy Spirit, proclaims Mary's own pregnancy. With a loud voice, she blurted out, this is the translation here, but proclaimed is probably better, God has blessed you above all women, and he has blessed the child that you carry. Why do I have this honor that the mother of my Lord should come to me? As soon as I heard your greeting, the baby in my womb leaped for joy. Fabulous. Elizabeth here, although she's not called a prophet, is one. She recognizes from her pregnant cousin something more than just the good news of a pregnancy. She recognizes the mother of her Lord. She recognizes Jesus' role even before he is born. Zechariah, her husband, doubted the angel. Elizabeth, filled with the Holy Spirit, makes the correct proclamation. And Mary then responds. The Lucan Christmas story is filled with remarkable news, unexpected but urgently wanted, hoped for news. Zechariah is told that his elderly, infertile wife will bear a child. Mary is told that she will have a child even though she has not yet had sexual relations. We are told that this newborn baby will be a Lord. Mary's Magnificat, her hymn, sings about status reversal, past, present, and future. Magi see a star, the good news of the birth of a new king. Herod himself receives some news, not good, that his rule is illegitimate because the true king of Israel has just been born in Bethlehem. We have to be open to staggering news, and rather than just say, oh, that can't possibly happen, rather than have doubt, one of the beauties of the gospel is it helps us envision the world otherwise, see the world differently. Following the Gospel of Luke's 4-verse, very fancy introduction, Luke tells us, during the rule of King Herod of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to a priestly division, and so we launch into the story of the birth of John the Baptist. Following Mary's visit with Elizabeth, Elizabeth gives birth. John the Baptist is named, and there's some fuss about this because they wanted to name him after a family member, but Elizabeth, the prophet, insists, no, his name will be John. And then the story of John the Baptist leads into the story of Jesus. But the setting is important here. For Luke, John the Baptist is set during the reign of Herod of Judea, locally, internally to the land of Israel. But the birth of Jesus has a slightly different setting. Chapter 2 in the Gospel of Luke begins, "In those days Caesar Augustus declared that everyone throughout the empire should be enrolled in the tax list." For Luke, Jesus is not limited to the people of Israel. To the contrary, his birth is set during the reign of a Roman emperor. And so we launch into the story of how Jesus was born not in Nazareth, which is where his family lived according to Luke, but in Bethlehem of Judea.
Okay. Well, I think we have about 15 minutes, and the next video is about 15 minutes, so I think we'll talk about this, and hopefully that'll give us enough time.
Do that video next week.
Yep,
Okay.
I'll do. Then you won't have to listen to me talk. We'll watch 3 of them next week.
Well, I will carry this around because it does help.
So, I mean, I guess first, is there anything that stood out to anyone about the things that AJ talked about?
I was struck by her statement that Elizabeth was a prophet.
And I was interested to hear the significance of the 2 different birthplaces of John the Baptist and Jesus.
And the fact that John was not named after relatives, which was kind of taboo at that time because you were supposed to honor your heritage.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I appreciate how they brought up the significance that each one was kind of born into, where John the Baptist was born to the community, of the Jewish community specifically, but Christ's birth was to that of the entire empire, the known world empire at that time, essentially.
Yeah.
Yes, what struck me was Zechariah, as a high priest, had a vision of the angel Gabriel appearing before. I wonder how that happened. I mean, was he in a trance or what? I don't know. I mean, that really struck me as very striking. If I had told you that I had a vision of an angel appearing before me, what would you think?
I believe you, Philip.
Well, here's what I wrote down. The one thing that she said that I liked. One of the beauties of the gospel is that it helps us envision the world otherwise, to see the world differently. I think that's an important point. Is there anything you learned about Luke's story, this part of Luke's story, that you didn't know before?
I really liked thinking about the telling of stories before people could read, or there were, everybody could have their own copy of the Bible and have, but how would you tell a story, and the joy and the humor of maybe telling a story about a man struck mute, when he was supposed to come out, have his one opportunity to bless the crowd, and here he comes and he's like,
in my work, I often centers around maybe bad news. And I ask students to tell me as much as they think matters, and many of them right to the chase, right? And so when we did that exercise, many of us were the birth narrative, right? But the story and being reminded, John prepares the way, right? And the importance of John in that process. And John's also just a hilarious, fun figure to think about, especially in contrast to Jesus, who feels a bit more serious at times and also loves riddles and things.
I love the 2 women in the story, both pregnant in improbable circumstances at different parts of their lives, but when Mary hears that Elizabeth is pregnant, she's like, I gotta go and see, I gotta go and be with her during this time, and that camaraderie among women.
And in that connection, I always wonder if Mary wasn't getting the heck out of town because she didn't want people to know she was pregnant. So it's kind of before she's showing much, and so she's going to go see my older cousin Elizabeth, and maybe she'll help me. Yeah.
When she said that gospel was acted out first instead of written or told or anything like that, I don't know.
I appreciate, Becky, you talking about especially the two women and the pregnancy narratives that are happening. I think whenever we're asked to think about Advent and the season of waiting and like the promptings today where it was like, think about a time where you had to wait a long time for something. I'm like, we had to wait for this dude and those other two yahoos for so long, and how like hopeful and anxiety producing that process is. I don't know that I've ever been, in some senses, more mentally unwell during the waiting of anything than the waiting for them and then the payoff, right? And so when I think of the Advent story and I think of that moment, it seems so like literally appropriate that it's two women waiting for a baby, right? And babies, again, under unlikely circumstances. I'm super old and holy crap, a baby. Is it gonna come? When is it gonna come? Is it gonna be healthy? Like all of these different things. And so it's just helpful to really center it around those two women and the waiting for births.
It was interesting that in this time, culturally, an unpregnant woman could be driven out of town. And certainly be a humiliation and shame to her family and extended family. And yet when Mary visits Elizabeth and John leaps in Elizabeth's womb, Elizabeth recognizes Mary as being blessed and doesn't shame her and accuse her of bringing down the family name. It's like the two women know what's going on, know what the heck is going on, and poor Isaiah is just like, oh, I don't know, I'm clueless.
Yeah.
Women always know what I was going to say.
Jack's comment was always. Yeah, I think she could actually have been stoned for her transgression.
We've kind of touched on this, but why do you think Luke chose to begin the Gospel of Zechariah and Elizabeth?
Say again.
Why do you think Luke chose to start with Zechariah and Elizabeth?
For the most part, in the first half of Luke's gospel, otherwise, John the Baptist essentially proclaims the coming of Jesus. So he is the person that is supposed to call that Jesus forward anyway. So yeah, I think it just makes sense to proceed him in that way also.
Do you think when we think of the birth stories that we think of Advent? Yeah.
Well, I wonder if, since she brought out the fact that the story is supposed to have some humor, that really maybe he's poking fun of the religious elite because the priest Zechariah becomes mute, and it's the women who are sharing the story and recognizing the truth and believing it right away, whereas the hierarchy doesn't get it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good.
More of a beginning of Jesus flipping a lot of things.
Yeah. Let's see, what else do I have written down here? Go ahead.
So this is a question. So was Zechariah mute? How long was he mute? For the whole pregnancy?
Yes.
So what I was thinking about was that he would have some power to enable somebody who would have been very shamed in her community to be accepted because he understood what the miracle was, but he was mute and couldn't convene that. And then did the people in her own community, they had no idea that this that Jesus was going to be Lord, right? The only
You mean
two
the-
people who understood what was going on throughout this pregnancy would have been Zachariah, Elizabeth, and Mary and Joseph, but not the rest of the community?
I think that's the implication, yeah, of the story.
Okay.
Well, yeah, that story is justification for Jesus being the Savior, where Matthew starts out with the lineage history, so Luke does it differently. He starts with a closer relative and just ties it in that way.
Yes.
Were you good?
Good timing.
So along these lines, what do you think would be different about it? Let's say Luke didn't start with Elizabeth and Zachariah. Do you think that? I don't know. What do you think? What do you think if this story wasn't how the gospel started?
Maybe it's like many good novels, there's a preface to kind of give you some background about what's going to happen and to get your mind ready for reading what's going to happen instead of just kind of dropping you in the middle.
Right, which is kind of what Mark does.
My viewpoint is that we have two improbable pregnancies that create a new life and world. And that story continues throughout his life.
Yeah, I was just thinking that the mystery, the story of Elizabeth, of Zachariah and Gabriel changes our frame of reference to a mysterious setting that is different than many other stories in the Bible or even in the Old Testament. So it changes our frame of reference.
I think the significance of Zechariah as a priest is important, and what does it look like when the state or the powers that be are the first to proclaim some level of like unpopular or unexpected news versus it coming initially being almost like a secret chair between two women, and then it becomes the mouthpiece of John, who is the voice of one crying from the wilderness, the man who eats locusts and honey, right? Like, there's a difference between something being proclaimed by the White House versus being proclaimed by the person in poverty living in slums somewhere in the US, right? That news feels different, it hits different, and I believe it and accept it differently, right? And so it means something that it comes from, that John's the one who prepares the way.
This whole thing today is just like resounding with me what's going on in Syria. I don't know why, but it's, the people who are coming up and the powers that be are gone. And it's a very different story, but it's history. That's what happens.
There's something really profound to me about this story being centered around the women and the children, particularly when you think about the crowd that would be receiving this story is a community where men hold all the power, have all the education, and for the most important people in the story to be the women and the children, and literally make the man mute where he cannot speak, and he's the one in power.
Along those same lines, I appreciate the fact that two different interactions, and I know we didn't necessarily read of Mary's interaction with Gabriel as well, but to compare
that'll be next week.
Zechariah's interaction with Mary, with Gabriel versus Mary's. I mean, they are how they each receive that news comes off very different.
Yes.
So.
That's a good point.
And we missed the whole Magnificat, the whole. Which, Elizabeth had one and Mary had one for us, and we would have missed that all.
Oh, we have
Hannah's from the Old Testament.
Well, yeah.
Hannah's.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So I think we ought to act it out.
That's above my pay grade.
You want to do the mute part?
That's your role.
We've got actually
I think we better get them a counselor.
We've been married 55 years. I was 10.
So, on that note, we will see everybody next week. Thank you very much, Erin. That was wonderful.